Well, I guess we'll go ahead and get started here since there's nobody else joining. All right, so my name is Deacon Anthony Stokes. Usually Father Tom or somebody would be here to kind of moderate and set this up, but he wasn't available. He had some church obligations, so it's just me. Just to get started, I have been the choir director at St. Maximus, the Confessor Orthodox Church in Denton, Texas, for over 20 years. I am also a trained conductor, and I teach music at the college level. I'm also a librarian, and have been obsessed with liturgics and the order of services for a very, very long time. Over the past few years, I've been teaching liturgics classes online, also other kinds of things, and teaching workshops and things for choirs. And recently I did a workshop, a one-time seminar called Matins, Not Just a Holy Week Service, and it was pretty popular. And after that, Father Tom Soroka and I talked about trying to offer something like that for the whole church, as the OCA would like to encourage more people to start trying to serve vigil. It's not as scary as a service as some people might think. And so what we've done is we've designed this 3-part series on the All-Night Vigil service so that more people can start to serve vigil as as we move forward. So what we're going to be doing today is talking about various parts of just the basics of liturgics and rubrics and things like that. Then next week on Sunday evening, instead of Saturday, next week will be Sunday evening. We have a big festival of Orthodox Christian arts here in the Dallas area next weekend, and Saturday's going to be full there. But so next Sunday evening we'll talk about Vespers in depth, a whole in-depth session on just the Vespers service, mostly as it pertains to being in vigil, but we will talk about daily Vespers and other things like that. But the idea is to get to where you have a good understanding of Vespers, great Vespers on a Saturday night for vigil, some of the musical things that you might need to know, where to find things, all that kind of stuff. And then the next Saturday, the last Saturday in February, we will do one more session on Matins and cover all the Matins stuff, which is the hard part. That's the part that most people are not familiar with. In a lot of our churches, Matins really has become a service that a lot of people only see during Holy Week. And of course, that's not a normal Matin service, the bridegroom Matins. But it is a service that's less frequently done, at least in the OCA tradition. ROCOR has kept the vigil as a pretty regular service. Obviously, our Greek and Antiochian churches have they split it, but they do Orthros or Matins every Sunday. So it's just something that in the OCA has not been as popular to do the vigil, and so that's what we're going to talk about. So I'm going to switch now over to a PowerPoint. I will lose a video because I'm on a Chromebook. I won't be able to see anybody. I won't be able to see the questions. So what we'll do is just, if you have questions, hold on to them, or you can type them in the chat. When we get to the question part in the last 30 minutes or so, we'll go through the chat and answer questions, or if you have a question that's complicated, then you'll feel free to speak up and do it that way. If you have an immediate question, I'll try to check the chat as we go along, but once I share my screen on a Chromebook, I lose a lot of things. So, all right, let's get over to this. Oops, sorry, I hit the wrong thing. Here we go. Okay. So first off, this is brought to you through the OCA Department of Liturgical Music and Translations, which can be found online at oca.org/liturgics. And we're going to be using the OCA website a lot in these talks, so that you can learn to find where things are, because everything that you're going to need is available pretty much on the OCA website. Now the caveat of that is my goal is to teach you to learn how to do this stuff yourself, without necessarily always needing to go to a source where it's already done. To me, it's fun to put together a service but not everybody enjoys it as much or has the time. So the OCA does provide that stuff to us, and we'll take a look at that and how it works and what's available. But I do want to thank everybody there, the OCA, Father Thomas Soroka, Dr. Vladimir Morrison, and Reader Philip Ritchie, who are in the music department there, who take care of everything for us. So the things we're going to talk about today, again, this is basics. So if you've been to seminary or something, you've already had this kind of stuff. You already know. If you've already been a choir director for many years, you're familiar with this. But if you're new or you just need a refresher, we're going to talk about the basics today. So we're going to talk about the liturgical year. What makes up the liturgical year? What are the different calendars? There's at least 3 different kind of calendars or cycles that we have to put together to make our services. We're going to talk about different liturgical books that you need to do vigil. We won't talk about all the liturgical books. There are obviously going to be way more than just the ones that we discussed today, but we are going to talk about the ones that are kind of needed for the vigil service. We're going to talk about one of the most important things when putting together services, which is the ranks or classes of feasts, and what that means, and what are they, and how do you tell? How do you know what rank or something a feast is? We'll talk about that. We'll talk about a little introduction to rubrics and what they are and where to find them. And then we'll talk about the All-Night Vigil as a whole service, some of the variations, but not getting into the details that we'll save for Vespers and Matins. And then at the end, we'll have time for questions again. All right, so we're going to start by talking about the liturgical year. Right, and there's a lot of things, a lot of calendars that come together in our liturgical year that are important. First off, the liturgical year starts September 1st, right, and runs through August 31st. The indiction or church New Year, September 1st, is kind of a minor feast, but our church liturgical year starts and ends both with Feast of the Theotokos, sort of as this, by the means of the incarnation. We start with the Theotokos' birth, September 8th, and we end with the Dormition, as far as the Great Feasts go, on August 15th. So our whole church year is kind of starts and ends with her life. But there are several different cycles that we have to look at here. First off, something that we are starting today, tonight, the Paschal cycle of services begins this weekend with the publican and the Pharisee. So the Paschal cycle basically refers to all of the services that are part of the Triodian and the Pentecostarian. And we're going to talk about what those books are in a few minutes. But it basically starts with this weekend with the service of the publican and the Pharisee. We say that we're opening the Triodian tonight. That's kind of the term used. And the Triodian contains services for everything from now until All Saints, Sunday of All Saints after Pentecost, or sometimes the second or third Sunday after All Saints, depending on the Pentecostarian Yom. And we'll talk about which kinds of services are in there, but this is going to dictate a lot of what we do. And of course, these are all services or feasts that have no date, right? The Paschal cycle isn't confined to specific dates. It's all based on when Pascha happens, which does have a date, and we're not going to talk about the dating of Pascha today. But the OCA does have a little calendar we'll take a look at here, that you hopefully can see here, and it goes through and shows you the a couple of years out, the beginning of the Triodian right here, this today with the publican and the Pharisee, leading all the way up to up to Pentecost, and even including the Peter and Paul fast, because that is again based on this calendar. So all of these dates that are here are all dependent upon this date of Pascha, right? So the Paschal calendar is kind of the first thing that guides the church. Everywhere in the world, every Orthodox country, we are celebrating Pascha, the Paschal calendar together, with the exception of Finland. If you don't know that Finland is the one church that is not does not use the Paschal calendar like everybody else. They are required by the government law to celebrate Paschal with the West, with the National Church of Finland. But everybody else serves this services based on the same calendar, right? So we let me let some more people in that came in late. Okay. And let me just double check something here. Okay, there we go. If you're just coming in, you won't need your camera for a while, and if you can go ahead and mute yourself, because I'm not on the screen right now where I can mute people. Okay, so the Paschal cycle is kind of our first calendar that dictates everything to us. Then we have something called the weekly cycle, and the weekly cycle is basically the services that come from the Octologos. The Octologos is basically means that this is a book of 8 tones, was developed mostly by St. John of Damascus in the 7th to 8th centuries. We rotate through the Octologos every 8 weeks. We are starting it again this weekend. Again, this weekend is the start of a lot of things, but we are back to tone 1 starting tonight. And starting on Saturday night through the next Saturday morning is when we use that version of the Octologos for that tone. And the Octologos is published in English, at least, in various forms. Sometimes it's in 9 volumes, sometimes it's in 5 volumes. Basically, you've got the weekdays for the tone are in a volume, and then there's a Sunday volume that has all 8 tones generally. And we'll talk about as we go through rubrics of Vespers and things, how you find where these things come from, and which hymns from the Octologos you're going to use versus others. But this is another cycle that we are kind of beholden to, is this weekly cycle of the Octologos that kind of dictates to us each week. Now, within the Octologos, every day has a theme. So there's sort of like a daily cycle in a way, but we also use daily cycle to talk about something else. But each day in the Octologos has a theme, and for every tone, that day is going to be about that theme. So Sunday, obviously, is the resurrection, right? It's the resurrection day. It's a little Pascha. Mondays are reserved for the angels. So if you pull out the Octologos for tone 1, you go to Monday, you go to Vespers, the hymns are going to be about all the angels and the vitalist powers. Tuesdays is for John the Baptist and other prophets. Wednesday is for the cross and the Theotokos. Kind of these you get these kind of double parts here. Thursday is for the apostles and Saint Nicholas. If you've ever done a weekday liturgy on Thursday with the correct rubrics, and you have like a double service, you can have up to 12 traparia, because the apostles and Saint Nicholas both get hymns, and it adds quite a bit. Fridays is remembering of the crucifixion. Saturdays, the martyrs and all the departed, and then of course we have those specific Sundays where we remember the departed throughout the year, or Saturdays, I'm sorry. So within the Octologos, there's this daily cycle that kind of is important and gives us kind of all the information that we need to do those weekday services. Then we have what we call the festal, or sometimes called the daily cycle. And these are services with specific dates, right? Things that have a calendar date, and they're always served on that calendar date for the most part. And of course, we have, to make things more complicated, we have old calendar and new calendar versions of these, right? And the Julian calendar, which is 13 days behind the Gregorian calendar, is still used quite a bit, right, throughout most of the Orthodox world. But even within the OCA, in Alaska, they use the Julian calendar still, and there are other churches within the OCA that are still old calendar. So it is important to kind of take note when we're talking about like finding rubrics or finding texts, that sometimes the OCA service is going to be for the new calendar dates, and you might have to go somewhere else to find the correct old calendar services if that's what you're doing. But then it gets more confusing with the fact that we celebrate some Russian saints on the old calendar and some on the new calendar, all kinds of stuff. Calendars are a big issue. I'll leave it with a good quote from Archbishop Dimitri of blessed memory, who always said the the church sanctifies the calendar doesn't sanctify the church. So if you have to worry about calendars, don't worry about it. The church sanctifies whatever calendar you use. So within that, though, we have all of these services, and they come from the Menaion. The Menaion is a 12-volume set of books that we'll see in a minute. That gives us all these daily services with specific dates. You may have seen the Festal Menaion, which is a smaller book that has just the great feasts in it, but they are also all in the main Menaion. And we have the feasts then ranked that we'll talk about by various ranks within those days, and we're going to see how that works. All right, let me just double check and see if there's anybody else who needs to come in. Well, that's the wrong screen there. Okay. Let me get out of there. We keep having people coming in, so I'm just adding everybody as they get here. Okay, so let's talk about liturgical books. Okay, so there are, I think I've added it up before. In order to have an Orthodox church, you have to have something like 18 books at least to do all the services that are required. It's quite a bit. Now, a lot of the stuff, again, is going to be available online nowadays. Maybe don't have to have the actual books to be able to do services. But if you wanted to have physical books, it's quite a bit of stuff. And it's several $1,000s, to buy these books, at least in English. If we were all serving in Slavonic or Greek, it would be way less because the books are cheaper that way. But we're going to go through some of the main books that you need. So the first book is the Orologian, which is the Book of the Hours. And it's called that because it includes the hours services, but it includes all the daily cycle of services, which is different from the daily calendar. The daily cycle we'll talk about. But the Orologian contains basically the readers and the choirs parts from what we call in Western music the ordinary parts of the services. The ordinary meaning the things that don't change. Every Vespers is going to have Gladsome Light in it. That hymn never changes. The hymns that Lord I've Cried will change, and those are called propers. They belong to the proper service for the day. But those are kind of Western musical terms. But the ordinary parts of the service are the ones that the reader or the choir would do that are unchanging. So the Orologian contains, Vespers, Matins in all its forms, the hours, Compline, the midnight office, usually the pre-communion prayers and canon, the post-communion prayers, some of the extra hymns, like maybe all the daily ex apostolaria or the hymns of light, things like that. Sometimes, and some Orologians will even contain morning and evening prayers also. So there's various ones in English. Currently, there are two that you can find readily. The one from Jordanville, this unabbreviated Orologian, the blue one in the top right, or the Greek style Great Orologian, the red one from Holy Transfiguration Monastery. The one in the bottom left corner is from St. Tychon's. It is currently not in print, but they are apparently going to be working on a new Orologian at some point. And I will also show you the one that's online to find as well. So the Orologian, basic book that you have to do Vespers or Matins or anything for the reader in the choir, probably. Next, obviously, is the service book for the clergy, right? And there are various service books that are out there. In the OCA alone, there are at least 5 different English approved priest service books that different people use. And it varies by diocese, it varies by people. Some people will use the one they always use, or the one they use at seminary, or the one that they use in their diocese. It varies, and that does obviously cause problems with translation a little bit, but that's the situation we're in. But the priest service book contains all of the priests and deacons parts for the services. What it does not contain is those things that are in the Orologian. So in the priest book, it would say, at Vespers, you make the entrance and the choir sings Gladsome Light, but it doesn't have the text of Gladsome Light. It has their parts, the clergy parts, and what's needed there. One thing that a good pre-service book does have is a calendar, and we'll talk about why that's important in a little bit. But again, there are various ones. St. Tychon's has recently, the past few years, published their Hieroticon, which is a 2-volume set containing 1 volume of the liturgies and 1 volume of other services like Vespers and Matins. Then they also have a version of the liturgy book in modern English as well, as opposed to the traditional English of the main volumes. So those are available, and then there's a people's liturgy copy made from that. So, but a service book is very important. And if you're a new choir director, I highly suggest getting a hold of a pre-service book. It's really important to be able to look through and see, what's involved in that and what they're doing as well, and kind of what kind of parts are going on. All right. The next book would be the Psalter. Obviously, the Psalter being the prayer book of the church. The Psalter has existed since before the church, and we still use it today. But a specific Orthodox Church Psalter is not just the Psalms from the New Testament. It's broken up in a very specific way for services, broken into the kathisma or the kathismata that we need. There are 20 kathismas in the Psalter. Very often a good Psalter will include the prayer rule for how to read the Psalter, and then also the biblical canticles that are used at Matins during Great Lent is another part that you find very often in Psalters. But you have to have some kind of Psalter to be able to do the services properly. Both Vespers and Matins contain Psalter readings, kathisma readings that are inserted into the service. These are just the 2 main English versions that are available, one from Jordanville again, and one from the Holy Transfiguration Monastery. And then again, next we have the Octoikos. Like I mentioned, you have to have access to an Octoikos of some kind in order to be able to do these kind of daily services, especially Vespers and Matins. Again, it can come in 9 volumes. It can come in 5 volumes. Some of them just have 2 tones per volume. Some have 1. There are various English translations available these days. And again, for the weekends, OCA provides a lot of that material too. And we've already talked about kind of the days. But the Octoikos, obviously a very much required book to be able to do anything. Then again, we have the Manaean, and the Manaean is for the daily services. It's broken up usually into 12 volumes, 12 monthly volumes, 1 for each month. It has services for every calendar day of the year. Very often it'll have multiple services sometimes if there are more than 1 commemoration on a day. Those will be found in the Manaean. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the differences between different Manaea, because different national churches have different services in their Manaean. But we will kind of discuss that. But the Festal Manaean, again, is a smaller book that just includes just the 12 great feasts and those texts as well. Right now, in the Russian tradition, there's really only 1 published Manaean in English, and that's the one from St. John of Kronstadt Press in Tennessee that you can usually get through Jordanville as well. But that is the only published book form in 12 volumes. There is a Greek-style Manaean as well available, but in the Russian calendar, there's just the 1. The books for the Paschal cycle that are required are the Triodion, which refers to 3 odes, that is referring to the canon at Matins on weekdays of Lent. Is the 3-ode canon, and so it's this book of 3 odes. And in English, the Triodion typically comes in 2 volumes if you are using the main one that's available, which is 1 volume for the Sundays of Lent and preceding Lent, plus Clean Week and Holy Week. And then there's a supplement volume that has the weekdays of the other weeks. So if you're doing daily Lenten services, you would need both volumes or access to at least the information from both volumes. Then when Pascha happens, we switch over to another book called the Pentecostarian, and in Slavonic, it's actually still called the Triodion of like Pascha. It still has that kind of term. But we have the Pentecostarian contains all the services starting with Pascha itself, with Paschal Matins, and going again through the Sunday of All Saints. And sometimes a different Pentecostarian will have various services for the second and even third Sunday after Pentecost as well. But those are all included there. And then, of course, we have our the most important book that most of us will never see, and that is the Typicon. The Typicon is basically our rule book or our guidebook. When you have a question that you just can't answer, the Typicon usually holds the answer in it. There are various Typicons that have existed over the years. The Russian tradition uses a version of the Savite Typicon for the most part. There's also the Greek Typicon of the Great Church. And there was the older Studite one, which kind of combined parts, but is not really in use as much. But every church, every kind of national church has a Typicon they use. And the Typicon is a very big, thick book that contains all the stuff on orders of services, rubrics, rules, things like that. The problem is there is no complete Russian-style Typicon in the English language. There have been attempts. There are drafts of parts of it, but there is no complete Typicon that answers everything. There will occasionally be questions that need to be addressed from the Typicon. Typically, I find that it happens around enunciation. There's always some kind of enunciation question that only the Typicon can answer, because enunciation is one of the most complex services to put together of the year. So the Typicon is a very important book, but most of us will never use it because it's not been written in English. What we do have is various other ways to find this information. A really good book in English is this Order of Divine Services by Peter Fakula, Matthew Williams. That's put out by St. John Kronstadt Press. There are 2 volumes available. One volume is the basic rubrics, which is the main one that you need, and then they do have a volume that has some specific days laid out for the year. Like if if February 2nd falls on a Sunday, you do this, or if it falls on this day, you do that. It's got certain days throughout the year. Now, there are some other ways to get this kind of stuff, and I'll have I think I've got a list of books in here somewhere, but there are online places to find a lot of these things. As far as the Orologian goes, the OCA has been putting an Orologian up on their website. Let some more people in. Every time I get off the PowerPoint, I see there's more people. So there is an Orologian site here on the OCA website that will contain various services that you can download and use. The typical beginning, or what I call the usual beginning, is that part that the reader does at the beginning of almost every service, starting with Glory to Thee, our God, all the way through Come Let Us Worship. So it includes the Trisagion prayers, O Heavenly King, all that kind of stuff. That's called the typical or usual beginning. Used at the beginning of almost all daily cycle of services. And then they have daily matins here. They have versions of the hours. They have Vespers. They have an all-night vigil text for you, small complement, and even the Paschal hours. For the most part, these are what Father Tom likes to call the common received OCA texts. But a lot of them are updated now to match the Hieroticon from St. Ticon's. So they do match those clergy service books. Let me just check here how we're doing. Oh, yes, I see some questions here. There's some statements about the Orologian from Jordanville was printed in brown too. If you buy it these days, I think it comes in blue, but I've also seen it in green before. All right, so the OCA does have again this Orologian site here that is available. They also have one of the best parts of it is the service text site, and we'll get into these more later, but this is basically a place where you can go and find the text that you need for Vespers and liturgy for most all the weekends of the year, basically, that are done, and then some other services that come up, just depending on on kind of the importance of the service. But you can see here, it's usually current for about the month that we're in. It may go a little bit farther than that each time, but we can go here and see that they have for this weekend, February 13th. They have the 34th Sunday after Pentecost. In tone, it's tone 1. You have the Publican and the Pharisee, and they have 2 different versions. So they have one in modern English, and they have one in the more traditional English. And you can download either version that you might need. And it's a Word document so that you can manipulate it however you might need to. If you need to copy certain hymns out to put in with yours, or however you want to do it, but it contains the text for Vespers and the text for liturgy. Eventually they do hope to start providing Matins at some point. So that's available for you. And then they also have, of course, the music website with musical downloads. And again, we'll look at some of these when we talk about the different services, but you can see they have the services, hymns from the services, the daily cycle. They have the Octoicos, or the weekly cycle, the yearly, or sometimes like a daily cycle with the from the Manaean. Mostly it's Troparion and Kentucky that you might need. And then for the great feasts, sacraments, and other kinds of things like North American saints, all that kind of stuff. So there's lots of music available here on the OCA website, as well as other places like the tutorial for learning the 8 tones in Kievan or Obicode, rubrics and things that we're going to look at here in a minute too. Okay. Let's see if I need to let anybody else in. No. And any other questions? No. Okay, good. All right, let's get back to the next part here. Okay, and one other online source that we'll actually be taking a look at some stuff from it later is this website from St. Sergius Cathedral, which is technically no longer a canonical Orthodox church. It is part of the other Russian Orthodox Church of abroad now, that used to be part of Rokor, but is not. But this website existed before they left canonical Orthodoxy, so I still use it sometimes. And the main thing that I use it for is for Slavonic texts, but they do have a full English Manaean and Triodian and Pentecostarian available. I'm not sure the translation, but they are really good for reference. So we're going to use them today to look at some of the services and to reference them. If you do Slavonic services, though, as a matter of fact, I just came from a Slavonic liturgy this morning, then this is a really good place to go to get service text that you might need if you don't have print versions of these things. So it's another helpful website that you can find to pull text. Another really helpful thing on it is that they have a general Manaean, and we talked about the Manaean a little bit being this 12-volume work with services for every day, but it doesn't include every single saint. Unfortunately, not every saint has had a service written to them, or at least not in English. So what do? Say you want to, do a service for your saint. You want to read Vespers for your name day, and your saint is maybe a lesser known martyr or something like that, and you don't have a service for them. The general Manaean provides general services for the different types of saints. We're not talking about ranks here, but types like martyrs, hierarchs, monks, confessors, those kinds of saints. And so you can turn to the general Manaean. You can go to the female martyr section, and it has a full service to a female martyr, and it has places where you just insert the name of the saint you're commemorating. So the general Manaean is really good for personal use. Most of the time in church we have, the Manaean will have a service that you can do, but again, if you have a saint that maybe doesn't have a full service or whatever, it can be a good place to go. For instance, my parish, which is the only, for a long time, and maybe still is the only St. Maximus canonical church in the United States, to St. Maximus Confessor. St. Maximus is not a high-ranked saint, and again, we're going to talk about ranks here in a minute. So if you go to the Manaean, and on our feast day, you open it up, there's not a full service in there. So for a very long time, we used the general Manaean for confessor to supplement the texts that were in the Manaean. Eventually, we commissioned a new service for St. Maximus to be written, and that was done. But before that, we had to use the general Manaean very often to kind of supplement those services. So these books are all very helpful and good to know about if you've never seen a general Manan. There are one or two, I think, published that you can buy, but there's, again, they're online nowadays. All right, let me get some coffee here. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the really interesting and really important part of all of this, and that is the ranks of feasts. And you can also use the term class, the class of feasts as well. We're not, when we say the ranks of the feast, we're not really ranking the saints or ranking the feast. We're not saying this saint is better than this one, they're a higher rank. Is basically referring to what kind of service is available for this saint, or what kind of service is prescribed. It may seem like some of them, are higher up, like obviously St. John Chrysostom, St. Anthony, St. Nicholas of Myra, people like this are, the major church fathers. Yes, they will be higher ranked, because they're important to the entire church. But then locally, there may be other saints that are not as important in one country to another, or for whatever reason, or again, just that the service was never written for them. For a lot of these saints, the services written are very short, and maybe it's because there's not as much known about them, or whatever the case may be. But when we talk about ranks of feasts, we're talking about what services are prescribed for these specific days. And there are various ranks, and we're going to look at those here. Then we'll look at some examples. We're going to go back to the OCA site here and take a look here at this page they have on the classes or ranks of feasts. And they do this in chart form, and the little chart also shows you which services would kind of be prescribed for that day, but I'll do my best to clarify it as we go. We have some more people waiting to get in. Okay. So this table kind of shows the different ranks, and they're from kind of top down in a way. But to kind of discuss that, well, the very top service of the year is Pascha, right? Pascha is its own class or its own rank, right? It's the Feast of Feasts. Nothing else is like Pascha. It's its own day. All the services that are done in very specific ways. It influences everything that comes after it. It's obviously all of these other feast days throughout the year are tied to it. It is its own class of feast, right? So, but right below Pascha, then we would have what we call the 12 great feasts, right? Again, starting with the Nativity of the Theotokos, followed by the Exaltation of the Cross, the entrance of the Theotokos in the temple, the Nativity, the Theophany, the Meeting of the Lord, Annunciation, Palm Sunday, Ascension, Pentecost, Transfiguration. All of those, are these great feasts of the Lord, or of the Theotokos, fall in this great feast category. And but liturgically, they're going to be the same as kind of the next category. But the great feasts are, a category kind of to themselves. Then below that, we might have, other feasts, Saints Peter and Paul, the holy archangels, things like that, kind of other major saints. And what we call those kind of like vigil ranked feasts. And basically what it means is that the All-Night Vigil is appointed to be served for that service when it's on a weekday, right? Vigil is always appointed for Saturday night. So we're talking about, like, if it's a weekday and it's the Feast of Saints Peter and Paul, the vigil service is appointed to be sung that night, or for that service. And what that means, as you can see, is it means there's great Vespers at Vigil, and there's Matins. And again, we'll talk about the Vigil. But a Vigil class feast means that the entire service has been written out for that feast day. It also means that you do little Vespers. And we'll talk about this order, but if little Vespers is appointed for these great feasts, or these Vigil class feasts. And all of the great feasts fall under the Vigil class celebration as far as order of services go. And again, we'll talk about kind of the order of the Vigil here in a little bit. So we have the great feast. We have these vigil ranked or vigil class feast. Um, the next one down would be the Polyelean level feasts. And basically what that means is that if you are doing Matins, the Polyelean is sung. We'll talk about this more in the Matins seminar, but little hint, the Polyelean is not actually appointed to be sung at every Matins service. It has become the tradition in a lot of places to sing the Polyelean every Saturday night, but it's rubrically not what is appointed for every Matins service, especially not weekdays, but not even Vigil Matins on Saturday nights is not always the Polyelean. We'll talk about that again though in a couple of weeks. But the Polyelean feast means that the Polyelean is appointed to be sung, and in the Russian tradition, that most likely also means there's a magnification to be sung after that. So the Polyelean feast, though, could mean Vigil. I mean, maybe part of Vigil on a Saturday night, but generally it's talking about when if Matins is separate, and you would sing the Polyelean there. But there could be an option to serve the Vigil if you wanted to, as the OCA chart here says. Below the Polyelean level feasts, the next one down is doxology feasts or doxology level. And again, basically it just means that at Matins, we're talking daily Matins now, the doxology would be sung instead of read at the end of Matins. That probably means that there are praises and no apostica verses. But daily Matins, you would have apostica verses at the end. So if it's a great doxology feast, that means that the doxology is sung at the end of Matins, and it ends kind of like a festal Matins as opposed to a daily Matins service. Doxology level feasts can include things like the conception of the Theotokos or something like that. Polyelean feasts in the Russian tradition include all the apostles and other kind of, maybe a saint that's a little bit more important. Not every, again, in the Church of America, like Saint Herman is a vigil class feast, but in Greece, Saint Herman may be an important saint, but he may not have the vigil service written for him in Greek. So he might be Polyelean or lower. So these can vary, the ranks can vary by national church. Again, there's some, like St. John Chrysostom, it's going to be vigil class for everybody, right? But some of these others, they can vary. The doxology feasts, again, are kind of like this next level down. Then below that, moving out of Matins, we have what are called Sixta-Hera feasts. Sixta-Hera feasts refers to Lord, I've cried at Vespers, again, which we'll talk about next time, and that there are Sixta-Hera in the Manaean for this feast. Or it may be there's 3 or 4 that they're doubled, but still it means that you sing 6 Stahira at a daily Vespers for this feast. Then the bottom one that we have is what this chart calls the ordinary days. I call them simple services. The simple service means that Lord, I've cried. There are 3 Stahira. It means you may have a Troparion, but you may not at Vespers. There's a Matins canon. There's a Kontakion at Matins, maybe an Expostularian, and that's all that was written for that saint. There's no praises. There's no apostica verses. Most likely, there's it's not a full written out service. So I call those simple services. In between simple and doxology, you can have one other kind, which is not on this chart, which is the double service. And the double service basically means you have 2 simple services combined for a day. And we're going to take a look at all of these types of services now. But this chart is here on the OCA website, and you can kind of see how it goes. Now, this is, again, really important because the rank or level of the feast for the day you're celebrating dictates how the service is performed and where the hymns come from. And there are a couple of ways that you can figure this out. Again, I'm teaching you the way to figure out yourself. The easiest way is to go to the OCA website, where you can just download the hymns already kind of set aside for you, at least for Vespers. But if you're doing Matins, you'll have to figure it out later. They do have an outline that we'll take a look at here in a minute too. But to figure this out on your own, there are mainly 2 different ways. One way is to look in your service book. A priest service book has a calendar generally, at least the STS Hieroticon does, and the priest service book from the Archbishop Dimitri's priest service book also has one in it. In that calendar, there is a key that has little symbols, and then in the calendar itself, there are symbols applied to the names for every day of the year. And so you would look through the calendar. You could go to today, which is February 12th, which is actually in this service book, in the OCA service book, is listed as just as a like a 60 here or a simple service for Saint Alexis of Moscow, but actually in the Russian Manayan, it's a vigil service. But either way, you look in the calendar and it has the symbol, and that symbol tells you the rank of the saint. If it has no symbol, then it's a simple service. The other way, though, because most of you may not have access to a priest service book or a Typicon as a calendar, is to look at the services themselves. So that's what we're going to do here. And what this means is if you have the Manayan, or you have access to a Manayan, or an online Manayan, you can look at the service itself, and you can tell what kind of service it is just by looking at the texts that are appointed in the Manayan for that day. So we'll go top down again. We'll start with the vigil one. So I've just pulled various dates off here for the different ranks so that we can look at them. But vigil is an easy one because it's very obvious. We look at the vigil service, and again, these are from that St. Sergius website. But when you're looking at the vigil service here, it's very obvious right here at the beginning. It says Little Vespers. If Little Vespers is appointed, it's a vigil class saint or feast. So if they're saying you should do Little Vespers, that means that you're going to be doing the all-night vigil later, and the Little Vespers is put there as a placeholder for Vespers in the afternoon. This is especially monastic practice. This is how they do it. So if there's Little Vespers, then it's a vigil class. You can also tell, by looking through the service, and if it has everything appointed to you. If at Great Vespers it says that there are 8 Stichira, if you've got Old Testament readings, again, these are things we're going to look at with the Vesper service. At Matins, if there's a postica verses at Vespers, if Matins has sessional hymns and all that kind of stuff, it's a vigil class feast. But the really easy way to tell is Little Vespers appointed in the Manayan? If yes, then it's a vigil class. And that's kind of the way it goes. So that's the vigil class one. Again, really easy to kind of tell. Now let's look at the Polyelean rank here. A Polyelean service, I chose Apostle Matthew because, again, in the Russian tradition, all the 12 apostles have Polyelean level feasts. You can see it doesn't mention Little Vespers, but you can tell that it does say do Great Vespers. Talks about doing Blessed is the Man. These are all, again, things we're going to talk about next time. But where that key point is if you scroll down to the Matins service, we want to find Matins. After the sessional hymns, it would say, something about the Polyelean or the Polyeleus. So here it says, after the Polyeleus, you do the magnification. So it's telling us that we're singing the Polyelean. And there's a magnification. So that's how you know it's at least a Polyelean service, but it doesn't have Little Vespers, so it's not vigil. All right, so pretty self-explanatory there. Same thing with the doxology service. Doxology services are very interesting. They feel like they should be Great Vespers but they're not always. They're usually daily Vespers, which is really kind of interesting. But some of these feasts seem like you're like, why aren't we doing Great Vespers for the conception of the Theotokos? But it's the way the service has been written. But you can see that, so we know now it's at least a 60 hero service that's telling us that. But, the only thing that really gives a difference between 60 hero and a doxology service is if you go to the end of Matins, you got to go past the canon, all the way past the praises. And here it tells us great doxology. So that's telling us we're singing the great doxology, therefore it's a doxology level service. That's how we approach the rubrics and figure out what to do. All right. If it wasn't a doxology, there would then be apostolic verses there afterwards. So then we have
Deacon
the
Anthony,
Oh yeah, hold on.
this is Diane from Albuquerque. The St. Typicon's Rubrics book that I think most of us have, that we get every year. Now they changed the format a couple of years ago, so it does list every single day, even the days that we don't have,
Right.
The complete rubrics for, and it does have the symbols there too.
Right. Yes, and we're going to talk about that book. But my goal is to teach you how to do this without that book. To be able to do this without any kind of helpful lists. But yes, it's all in there, and we'll talk about the St. Typicon's book. I've got a link to it here. But yes, that's a very good point. Yes, there are calendars and lists that tell you this, but sometimes you don't have access to that. Or your church doesn't. You don't use the book. I haven't. We at our church, we don't buy that book anymore because we've learned how to do it on our own, and it's kind of more fun to put the service together without having to check. So this is a way that you can, this is how you recognize it, just by looking at the service. So the 6 to hear service, you can see it tells you 6 to hear here at Vespers. To double check that it's not a doxology service, you would just scroll to the end again of Matins, and you would see that it does not mention the doxology, but it has apostolic verses for Matins, and that tells you that it's not. It's the 6 to hear, but it doesn't have the doxology. The double service, just so you see what it looks like, again means that there are two unrelated saints generally. Now there are lots of services that are written for two related saints together, but a double service liturgically means it's two kind of unrelated saints that fall on the same day, and are kind of put together here. Now this one, because it's during the after feast of Nativity, they're suggesting that you move one of these saints, but this because it's the leave taking. But just so you kind of would see in the Manan, it would actually appear at the top. It would say, this martyr here and this martyr here are both kind of commemorated on that day, and they just are doubling the services, the hymns, and you kind of alternate which one you do when. But again, we'll tell you right there in the service. And then the last one, the simple service, right here, 3 Stichira, Lord, I've cried. It even has Stichira that if it's during Lent, depending on when, or during one of the fasts, depending on when we picked this out. This is from December. So during the Nativity fast, there are hymns that are given in case you need more for the Theotokos there. And then you've got basically just the canon at Matins, Kentucky, and then there's nothing else after the canon. So the simple service is really very simple. There's very little in the service that you're going to be using. And so that's if you have access to a Manan and you're not sure, sometimes I'll get to to daily Vespers on a weekday, and I get to church and I'm like, what, I just look in the Manan real quick to see what service I can tell, is it Vigil class tonight? Are we doing Great Vespers? Are we doing daily Vespers? Kind of what are we doing? Again, if you have a service book, you can always look at the calendar, but again, they don't always match each other. So whatever Manan you're using is probably the best thing to go off of. Now, I will also say, in relation to the ranks of feasts, priests, the parish priest has, kind of this authority, or in a way, economia to change the ranks of feasts for various reasons. Again, like in our case, St. Maximus being a simple service, but he is our patron saint. So therefore, it's a vigil class saint for us. And so we're the only church in the United States that celebrates St. Maximus as a vigil class, because it's our patron saint. Generally, it's going to be the opposite way. It's going to be moving it down. If it's a polyolane level service and you don't have access to all the texts you need, or you don't have enough singers to do, the polyolane matins, or whatever the case may be, a priest can say, I know it's polyolane, but let's just do it as a doxology level or a 6 to hear service. We don't have time to read the Old Testament readings, or whatever the case may be. It's the priest's discretion. You always want to make sure that as a choir director, what the priest wants you to do, and kind of what kind of service you should be doing, to fit that in. Let some more people in. It'll work. Okay, here we go. So that's and if you have questions about that, we'll get to some more questions. But the ranks of feasts are really really important, because it dictates to you how to use the rubrics, which we're going to look at now, and how to figure that out. And we'll talk about the St. Ticon's book here in the rubrics section, and take a look at what the OCA offers too. So when we talk about rubrics, the Oxford Dictionary just rubrics there's a couple different kinds, right? You have rubrics in school, in college. That's the grading guide for a teacher, basically. Like if they have 5 paragraphs, they get this many points, whatever the assignment is. But then there's a definition that's a direction in a liturgical book as to how a church service should be conducted. And that's exactly what the rubrics are for us. They are our guide and rules, in a way, to telling us how we should be serving the service, what order it needs to go in, where do things come from, all of that different kinds of stuff. The ultimate source for the rubrics, of course, is the Typicon, like I said. But most of us don't have a Typicon or somebody who can read it to be able to check all the information always. So you have to try to find it in other places. So in English, again, there's a couple places. There's the Order of Divine Services book that we already talked about. That book we'll talk about more, probably maybe in the other sessions. But that's a book that's telling you how to do it yourself. So you look at the first chapters on Sunday services, and it will say if it's a Polylan service on a Sunday, and then it tells you the rubrics for putting together the services. It's not by date. It doesn't say, the Feast of the Apostle Matthew on this day or whatever. It's just by rank and day of the week. And then there's a second for weekday. Then there's a chapter on Lent and things like that tell you how to do things. If it's going to be, actually, this would be happening with the Triodian. You've got generally when the Triodian is being served, the Manaean services are kind of not. But this year we have Forgiveness Sunday is also the feast of Saint Raphael of Brooklyn, which for the North American Church could be a vigil class saint. So there are ways in this rubrics books to combine those. And how do you combine a vigil class saint with a Triodian service, and what has to give there? So all of those kind of things are found in the Typicon, or this Order of Divine Services book. Then, of course, as Diane just mentioned, the easy way is to buy the Liturgical Rubrics book from St. Ticon's Monastery, which is a book that they publish every year, and actually every church in the United States. Rocor publishes their own book. The Greeks publish their own book. The Antiochians, everybody publishes a liturgical guide pretty much for every year, and it covers all the weekends and other major services. The only problem is it doesn't have every day of the year. So if you if you want to do vigil for something, say there's somebody in your church who's named after a specific saint, they want to do a vigil, the priest wants to do it, or at least Great Vespers or whatever, it may not be in that book. So you've got to have another way to figure out how to put that service together. And again, if it's got the calendar in it, that's great. It also has other notes in there. It always has the section talking about the Paliland and when it's supposed to be sung, various parts like that. So that book is available and you can buy it. It's like $40. You buy it every year, and it tells you the order of the rubrics for each week. Now we're going to see that the OCA has a lot of that stuff now too, but again, not for every day. So it really kind of depends on how often you're going to be serving services. Some churches are have maybe multiple priests and they have multiple services during the week. So if you have a lot of weekday services, you've got to have access to the rubrics and to be able to figure out how to put them together. If you are in a mission where the priest only comes on Sundays, then you have less that you have to do or to visit. So depending on what you're going to be doing, you need to have access and know where to find all these things. So let's take a look real quick at the OCA's rubrics website, which is a newer part of the OCA music website that they've been starting to add these rubrics. Again, we already saw that they have the Orologian here. And then they have 2 other sections here. One is an outline for the services, and we're going to take a look at this more as we get to the other 2 talks. But they specifically have here an outline of Vespers. They have some things about reading the Kathismas. They have showing you the variable parts during Lent and Pascha or outside of it. Then they have all these like specific articles about Vespers, information on Little Vespers and Lord I've Cried and Censing and all this kind of stuff. And then they just have some other articles here, so that they're still working on the outlines. They don't have full outlines for every service, but they do have Vespers in here. And then they do have this other section here, though, this order of upcoming services. So we saw that they have, texts for lots of services, right? Those he offers the text for all the Sunday services and for other days that may be, maybe important or coming up. But then they also have rubrics now for every Sunday for the next few months coming up. And if we look at let's look at this Sunday here. I'll just open this file. And you can see basically this is a rubric guide for the entire service. So it's telling you how to do vigil basically. And the exact order of Great Vespers of Vigil. And then here are the rubrics for something like Lord I've Cried, 7 Stichira of the Resurrection. Those are going to come from the Octoikos, right? 3 Stichira from the Triodian, for the publican and Pharisee. The glory verse that Lord I've Cried is for the Triodian, now and ever the Dogmaticon in tone 1. So they do have these rubrics now for Vigil for Sundays. So if you're going to be, you need to get access to it and you don't have one of those books, or you don't have the St. Ticon's book, they do have it up here on the site. Another reason to using something like the Order of Divine Services to learn how to do it yourself is that occasionally there could be a mistake in the St. Ticon's books or somewhere else. Who knows? Or again, your priest wants to do it a little bit different way. Maybe they don't want to do the Theotokia the exact way the book says or something. You may have a local practice. There are various sayings that are something about like every church or every priest is their own typicon, if you've ever heard that. So there could be local variations that you have that would be easier to figure out by using the Order of Divine Services or something like that, or just a rubric list as opposed to a published version of the rubrics. Again, you might want to change the way you do certain things. So all these different ways to find the rubrics are available. I could suggest using any of them that you can or that you need. All right, so let's talk a little bit now about Vigil as a service, and kind of the different incarnations of it and how it can work in incorporating it into your church. So there are a couple of different kinds of vigils, right? And the big one, the original, you could almost call it, is what we would nowadays, what I call the Athonite All-Night Vigil. The Athonite Vigil basically includes everything for a whole day in one service. Almost all of the services from the daily cycle of services exist in the Athonite All-Night Vigil. And this is again designed. The vigil itself comes from monastic practice of keeping vigil through the night, of either privately or together in church, and then turning that into some kind of big service. Very often in a lot of monasteries in Mount Athos, this is done every weekend. And then again for various vigil class feasts. Here in America, you can go to an Athonite monastery, for their feast day, and you might see some kind of version of this all-night vigil done, at any of the major monasteries or the Russian monasteries too, possibly, or very often in parish practice sometimes. There have been various Greek parishes lately that have been doing kind of all-night vigils for certain things and bringing in lots of singers. Just last week in Boston, they did one for St. Richard, actually, because the chanter was named Richard, and he had a service commissioned, and he invited singers and chanters, and they did this all-night vigil, the whole thing overnight. So the order of the all-night vigil in the Athonite practice is that you have in the afternoon, maybe around 4 o'clock or so, you have Little Vespers. And again, Little Vespers is kind of a very shortened Vesper service. It's just a placeholder. It's keeping the place of Vespers in the monastic calendar in the afternoon as a little service that they do before dinner. And it's kind of just, it's there. Again, Little Vespers is generally only appointed for when the vigil is going to be served. Then they'll have dinner probably. Then they'll come back, generally in the Athonite tradition, sometime maybe around 10 p.m. or so. And they'll start with Compline. And during that Compline, they'll sing the Akathist to the Theotokos. So it's small Compline with the Akathist. That's going to be followed by possibly the 9th hour, maybe, but the Great Vespers in its entirety. And when a lot of times you see an all-night vigil, in an Athonite tradition, you've got, the 30-minute ending to Psalm 103 and a very long Litia and all this kind of stuff. It's the full big service. Great Vespers, it can last over an hour, almost 2 hours sometimes, just Vespers alone, in this Athonite Byzantine monastic tradition. And it includes the Litia service. Then at the end of Vespers, they'll usually incorporate some kind of spiritual reading. It might be from the life of the saint that's being commemorated. Could be something else, something they wrote. And then in the Russian tradition, there used to be, there's the practice of sometimes reading from the New Testament in between Vespers and Matins as well. But there's some kind of spiritual reading that takes place here. Then you begin Matins with all the kathismas, all the readings, all the canons, everything. Basically a big full Matin service, the whole entire Polyleian. Again, in an Athonite practice, the Polyleian can last upwards of 30 minutes, depending on how they chant it. That's then followed by the first hour, maybe the prayers before communion, that's why they're in italics. The third, 6th hour, the Divine Liturgy, and maybe the prayers after communion, depends on the practice there. But this from Compline to liturgy can last, 5-6 hours, sometimes in this practice, overnight. So that's the original kind of format of the all-night vigil. Now, can you do this in a parish? You can. I can tell you from experience. My parish has done several all-night vigils. We tend to do it for New Year's Eve, actually. Every year we have one scheduled. But we've done them other times, especially if a great feast falls on a Saturday. We'll do an all-night vigil from Friday night to Saturday morning. Like maybe the protection of the Theotokos or something like that, St. John Chrysostom, the Nativity of John the Baptist. We've done all of those as all-night vigils. So it is doable in a parish practice. You wouldn't want to do it every weekend because you're very tired the next day. But it is something that can be incorporated every maybe once a year or something. And it's a very interesting experience to be in the church all night like that, keeping vigil and doing these services. So that's kind of the original version. What we call the all-night vigil nowadays in the Russian tradition, this kind of modern Russian style all-night vigil, is a much more compact version of that that's meant for the eve of the feast, the night before the feast day. And it includes Great Vespers, maybe with or without Litia, and Matins, probably with some abbreviations, and then maybe the first hour. That's why those things are in parentheses. This is the form that we will be talking about in the other two sessions. When we talk about Vespers, we'll talk about kind of the standard kind of Great Vespers that you would encounter at a regular all-night vigil in a parish practice, right? And everything that we're going to need to do to do that. And then the kind of the general Matins, and some of the different ways you can shorten Matins. There are lots of ways to do it. There are various practices around the OCA, especially people who do Matins and how they shorten it and what kind of abbreviations they do. And then again, whether or not you do the first hour or not is kind of optional there. There is a third type of vigil in the OCA that we will talk about as well, which is, from my understanding, I've only ever seen this done once or twice, but I believe it comes from St. Vladimir's seminary. It was a practice there, but it's called the Cathedral Vigil, and it basically involves serving a Great Vespers like normal, and then doing Matins as a shortened service that mainly picks up the musical highlights, like the Troparion at the beginning, God is the Lord, the Troparion, then maybe skipping right to the Polyolaean, then doing the Evangeliataria, then having the Gospel reading with the Praemenon, having beheld the resurrection of Christ, and then the dismissal. So you stop Matins before you get to the canon, and you end it there. Generally, that can be done. I've seen it done in maybe an hour and 15 minutes or so to do that Cathedral Vigil, as opposed to the 2 to 2.5 hours of the fuller all-night vigil that you might see, kind of on a regular basis. So these are some of the different types of vigils that we'll talk about. And so when we get into the Vespers seminar next week, we'll look at all the different parts of Great Vespers, kind of how, what's involved, what do you need, where do you find things, all that kind of stuff, and kind of how to put that together. And then when we do Matins, we'll talk about all the different parts of Matins and the various forms, whether you're doing this Cathedral style Vigil, which may be a good way to start doing Vigil, or whether you're going to try to do a little bit fuller version. I will, tell you as an aside, at my parish, we started as a mission 20 years ago with 10 adults. And we, within 6 months, we were doing Vigil, and we've never stopped. And, but we built to it. So we started with Vespers. Then very quickly we added Compline to our Vespers, small Compline, and read the canon for communion. And then we eventually switched that over to reading some of the Matins canons. And then within 6 months, we decided to start doing Vigil, and we've just never stopped. And, for a very long time, there were only 2 of us at Vigil. It would be the priest and myself, and I would read and sing the whole service by myself. So sometimes I think we think that Vigil is, we can't do it because we have a small choir or we don't have enough people. You can do it by yourself. It takes a little bit of willpower to do that, but it's something that a practice you can build on in different ways. And the Cathedral Vigil might be a very good way to start incorporating that. Because you get some of the bigger musical parts. I was, even in Moscow, I was watching the nativity services from Moscow this year with the patriarchal service, and they did the vigil together. So they actually did Great Compline, mostly in its fuller format. But then for Matin, and they started at like 10 o'clock at night. Then for Matins, they did the kind of a version of this. They just did like the musical highlights of Matins. They did the Polyolaean, then the Magnification, then the Gospel reading, and then just parts of the canon, and I think part of the praises and the doxology, and then they, or maybe they even didn't do all that if I remember correctly. And then they went right into liturgy. So it all is one kind of overnight service. So even in a patriarchal service, sometimes they do this kind of cathedral, this shortened vigil. So that's kind of where it comes from, and so it's another option that we'll explore when we talk about Matins and kind of how you can do that. All right. Before we get to the questions, I just wanted to show you some books that you can look at for reference on some of these topics that are very helpful, and there'll be a bibliography for them that'll be available. I believe we will find a way to send these slides out to everybody that's registered in here today, and then the presentation itself again will be posted on the OCA's YouTube channel within a few days. So just some books that I've found that can be helpful if you're really interested in this kind of stuff, in this liturgics idea of rubrics. These 2 volumes from Archimandrite Joe Getcha in France, the Typicon Decoded, which talks really in depth into some really interesting Typicon ideas and research. It's a really great book. And then a newer volume on the Euchologian. The Euchologian, which we didn't talk about, is kind of the book of needs, which is everything else that's not part of the daily cycle of services, right? All of the sacramental services, weddings, funerals, baptisms, all the different kinds of blessings, Molyebens, pretty much everything else is from the Euchologian or the Book of Needs, or the Trebnik in Slavonic, right? The Trebi services. So these are books that are about these services. They're kind of research books. One of my favorite books for learning basics of services is Russian Church Singing Volume 1. by Johann von Gardner. The second volume, which gets into kind of more detail on specific styles of singing in Russia, is great too. But the first volume is very much a liturgics book in the first 2 chapters, and goes through all the services with outlines and explanations of hymns and things like that. It's great. It's the textbook I use when I teach liturgics to anybody. So for years I've used that book. It's a great little book. A Rokor version is the Manual of Orthodox Church's Divine Services. It's another kind of older book that kind of goes through the different services for you. One that's in kind of one designed for clergy, the Practical Handbook for Divine Services, goes through it kind of from a clergy standpoint. Then you have also by the same author, the Daily Liturgical Prayer Origins and Theology. That's going to give you some kind of a history and a liturgical theology look at services. And then some of the books by Father Robert Taft, who was a Slavic Jesuit archimandrite who taught at the Vatican and things like that, but is one of the best liturgical scholars that of the 20th century. And his short book, there's some formatting weird issues, but the Byzantine Rite is a short little history, like a pamphlet. But then his bigger book, The Liturgy of the Hours in the East and West, talks about the origins of services like Vespers and Compline, talks about monastic practice versus the great church practice, and all those kinds of things. So these are all some really great little reference books that you can look at. And again, there's a bibliography here that's available as well. So I believe that's going to lead us to our questions part. And here's my email address, which is also in the article that talked about this. If you have further questions, but I'm going to get out of the presentation, stop sharing, go back to Zoom here. A couple of people trying to get back in one more time. And so, okay, first let me look here into the chat and address these questions real quick. Let me pull the chat up bigger, and we still got some people trying to get in. Okay. Okay, so we got some different comments that we should stop using the term stahira and call them verses or stanzas. Yeah, possibly. There are some words that we still say in Greek, and they should probably stay that way. Some that maybe we can change. I've heard Ispola sung in English before, and it's just kind of weird. So, there's some things that everybody still says in Greek. But let's see. Yes, we'll be sharing the presentation. Yes. How many attend our vigil services? We tend to do on Saturday nights. Vigil is usually about half of what we're going to have the next morning for liturgy. That seems to be pretty consistent. Last week we had 62 for vigil, and I think we were about 120, 130 for liturgy. Those are post-COVID numbers. Pre-COVID we were about 160, but we had some big families move to other states, and we lost some numbers. But yeah, we do about half at vigils. And again, vigil is a different service from the liturgy, right? Where there's no, there's the Eucharist isn't occurring, things like that. Vigil is a service that people should be able to feel free to come for part of, or come and go, or maybe not stay the whole time. We have people who come for Vespers and then leave. We have people who come for just Matins. We have some people who come at the beginning and then they leave after the anointing, right? So there's some different times where people can come and go, and it's not like it's not like the liturgy where you need to be there by a certain time and you're going to partake in the Eucharist. So people can come and go at vigil. Let's see. Let me see some more questions. Yeah, the email address, again, use the one that's on the it's Gmail, not oca.org. I see somebody asked about that in there. So let's see. Some OCA churches have Matins as part of vigil. Some have it Sunday morning. It is true. There are some OCA churches that do Matins on Sunday morning, and that's great. It can be done either way, and that's the important part is to do it. And we'll talk about that maybe here in a second. Theological merits or pros and cons of each. It really kind of depends on your people. Now, I grew up in a Greek church, and I can tell you that Orthros was very lowly attended on Sunday mornings, and everybody would show up just for liturgy. So very often the only people in Matins were the chanters and the priest. So that doing it in the morning before, you've got to know your crowd and your people. But Vespers and Matins, the two services are both, they're part of the preparation for the liturgy. Liturgy isn't a standalone thing. You prepare the night before, and clergy have to at least read Vespers or Matins before they can serve a liturgy. If they don't serve it, they at least have to read it at home. It's supposed to be part of their preparation. So doing them is part of that. Let me see what we've got here. We've got more questions. Yes, we will talk about when daily services or daily Vespers as opposed to Great Vespers next week in the Vespers seminar. So you'll have to come back for that part if you have questions on those things. So let's see. Okay. All right. So if anybody wants to ask a question, on camera or on their microphone, you can feel free to do so. Now let's just do maybe one at a time. If you want to say so in the chat or something, then we can you can go ahead and unmute yourself, or if anybody has a question, go right ahead. We've got plenty of time. Anybody have questions? Really? Wow. I explained it all so well that there are absolutely no questions. Everybody's going to start doing vigil tomorrow or tonight, right? I hear somebody's got a question.
Yeah, Diane from Albuquerque. And maybe you'll go over this more in Matins, so I might be jumping the gun. Mm-hmm. So you can put me off if you want to. But it seems like leaving out the canon to make Matins shorter, seems like it's like cutting out a lot of the heart of Matins and the teachings. So that
so I'm glad you brought that up. Actually, I was going to say something about that today. So one of the reasons that vigil is so important, and doing it on a different day, or at least doing it, if you do it Sunday morning, doing it then is important too. But she's completely right. The Matins service is where most of our theology is found. It's not in Vespers. Vespers, yes, has a few hymns, but it's where a lot of the the hymns about the saints are found, and especially in the canon. The canon is this great big part of the service. It takes up most of Matins if you do it in a fuller sense. And again, yes, we will talk about it when we come to it. But let's just look at the next couple of weeks or the next few months. If you only go to church during Lent on Sunday morning, you would never know that it's Lent, right? There is nothing in the liturgy really that gives us any kind of Lenten themes, unless you do Beatitude verses, and even then it's only going to be like four verses in the Kentuckian maybe, and that's it for these next couple Sundays especially. It's at Matins where we hear "Open to me the doors of repentance." It's at Matins where we hear the penitential canons for the prodigal son, for the last judgment, for the expulsion of Adam and Eve from paradise. It's at Matins where we get by the waters of Babylon for 3 weeks, starting next week. All of these things take place in the Matins service for Sundays. But there's still, even then, though, there's no Lenten notes. If you don't go to church during the week of Lent, you don't hear a lot of the Lenten stuff. So, and yes, there are a lot of churches that sing some of those things at liturgy, like during priest communion. But we're not going to. I can do a whole week's lesson on priest communion music and what you should and shouldn't sing. But the liturgy is not the place for that stuff. It's not the place for those repentant hymns. It's not the place to sing "Open the Doors of Repentance," because that's meant for the Matin service before that. So if you don't go to, if you're not doing those services, then you do have to find other ways to put them in. I know people who sing some of the hymns like before liturgy, maybe. I don't know how they do that. But you're not hearing the Lenten themes if you don't have matins. And so you miss that with a lot of things. And then you end up getting, yes, maybe you do beatitude verses, but you're getting some stuff that's way out of context then, because you're not getting all the rest of the canon that surrounded it. You're just getting these four verses thrown in from the canon from the night before. So yeah, that's a really good point that that matins is where a lot of the meat of the service is, especially for specific feasts and saints. So yeah, so there's a bunch of stuff in the chat here. So we got some questions about matins. We'll take care of that when we get to the matins. The recording should be available again on the OCA YouTube channel in a couple days. Let's see, another good resource. Let's see. Talk about leaving out the Kathisma. Yeah, we'll talk about that at the matins sessions. How many people do we have singing at Vigil? Do we use actual books, or do we have binders? And where can you find the Expostularian? Yeah, those are all good questions. So my choir ranges. Sometimes at Vigil, there's only a couple of us, but it just depends. And my choir comes and goes too. So I'll often have some singers that leave, a lot of singers that leave after Vespers for various reasons. And then some that come maybe for matins. Generally though, for Vigil, I'll have anywhere from 5 to 14 singers at Vigil. With my choir, we do have binders. We put everything in binders. So we do have the actual books. We read the canon directly from the Manean and the Octoacos. We still use the books for the reader, but we don't sing out of them unless something didn't get typed up for some reason. We type everything up and put it into binders. And the Expostularia come from whatever, depending on the service. If it's a daily matins, or if it's they'll either be in the Manean or the Expostularia for Sundays should come out of the Octoacos, and then or the Orologian. Actually, I'm sorry, the Expostularia a lot of times are in the Orologian in the matins section, the daily ones, and then the other ones are from the Manean. Well, let me see, step-by-step guide to assembling services. So that's kind of what we're going to be doing with the Vespers and Matins. We're going to talk about building services in those two sessions. Let's see. Yes, please do a session on the music for the priest communion. Yes, that would be great. I mean, it's a very interesting topic, the priest communion and how it developed into a concert. They actually call it the concert in Russian churches. Yeah. That's because that's where a lot of things are thrown in. But yeah, it's a kind of interesting topic. What other questions? Anybody else have questions? Anybody else want to speak up and ask a question?
I have a question.
Sure.
When we were at an Antiochian church, it was really easy to do weekday services because you could do them just with one chanter or two chanters. But I find that generally Russian music doesn't lend itself as well to being sung by one person. And so I don't know if you have something like when you're doing the service, do you just sing the Russian tones, or do you have something else that you found that you like better than just singing the 4-part Obichud tones?
Sure. So I was actually talking to somebody about this last night in a different class, and they were realizing that, that when you look at Obichud, that the melody is actually in the alto, and they're like, whoa, how come everybody always sings the soprano part as the melody when they're by themselves? So you could, if you were to do that, that's always something you look at as singing the alto. What I do when I'm alone is I sing Kievan chant, because the Kievan melodies lend themselves to being more melodic, and the melody is in the soprano in Kievan chant. So you can do that. But I actually have a church of we're an OCA church where I have the luxury of being the only choir director that's ever been there and developing the entire music program over 20 years. We do a lot of Byzantine chant. Well, not a lot, but we do some. And I actually have a few chanters who can read notation. They can read Byzantine notation. So sometimes if they do, we do, and we also have daily services. Our priest has daily matins and daily vespers, at least 4 days a week, if not all of them. So I'm not there all the time, and sometimes there will be people who do Byzantine chant occasionally, but generally we do sing Oblacode by ourselves sometimes. But if it's me by myself, I do Kievan chant nowadays. I've just started incorporating it in, trying to get it in people's ears to maybe eventually make the entire switch to Kievan chant, but that's going to take time. But I find that Kievan chant is good for that. And again, on the OCA website, in the tone section, they have tutorials on learning both. And there's some other online tutorials that you can go. St. Tychon's is, I don't know if they've already done it, or if I think they did a workshop on the tones, but they may do it again. There are places you can go and try to learn that stuff to learn how to do it. But Kievan is really good when you're by yourself or with just a couple of people, especially if you just want to do the melody. Or you could always learn Znameni chant, I suppose, too.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask if there's a good resource for learning the tones in Znameni.
Not that I'm trying to think of where you might be able to find some of it. The old St. Tychon's 2-part music website from when Abbot Sergius was the choir director is still up, and they have quite a bit of Znameni stuff on there. I don't know if they have everything for every tone, but they had some good resources in 1 or 2 parts. But yeah, as somebody mentioned here, the Artifact Institute also has some classes for learning tones with Maria Sheehan, but the St. Tychon's has also run some sessions on that. So, but the Kievan is really good, and you can just download the model. The OCA website has models for the Kievan tones, and I just have I have those stapled in one of the Vespers books. And if I'm by myself, I just sing from that with text, and it works much better. Do you think we could record special melodies for in the future? Special melodies is a really interesting thing. Vespers and Matins is where a lot of those things are called for, and they can be hard to find. There is a good website that I can, when I send out the presentation, maybe I'll try to add it into the presentation before we send it out. There's a good website that's an old Rocor site that has a lot of the services have special melodies typed up already. The Diocese of the West is good for that too. Father Lawrence Margitich in Santa Rosa, he has done a lot with special melodies. And if you go to the Diocese of the West's liturgical music site, there are some special melodies there that you can find too. And somebody said that Serbian chant is also a good melodic and easy to sing solo kind of. Serbian chant is kind of almost meant to be sung by itself also. So, and I'm surprised some Carpatho-Russian. Oh, there it is. Okay, as soon as it popped into my head, somebody typed it in. Yeah, Carpatho-Russian chant is meant to be sung, almost by itself like that too, with small groups. So, there are options like that out there. But if you use Oblacode and you want something that's not too far different, starting to learn Kievan chant is a really good way to go, because that's where it came from. Good. Who else has a question? Kim, you have a question?
Yeah. Hi, how are you?
Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too. Is there a place where we can go to learn how to look at the words and apply it to the music? So one of the challenges with the translations for our church is that we use a Russian translation, which doesn't align with what you guys have on the OCA.
Sure.
And so it's hard for me to figure out how to relate the Russian translation to the music because the words are different. Is there somewhere where we can go to learn how to do that, or what the process is?
That's a great question. I would think that they probably teach that in some of the sessions that they do on learning the tones. I was always told that the way they would teach it sometimes at seminary would be to take newspaper articles and try to set them in the tones to try to find that part. Because what you're doing when you're looking at that is you're looking at the text and trying to make sure that that text is understandable, and that the musical, like in Oblacode, especially those held notes, those half notes in the melodies, that those are on the correct syllable. It's not on some random. You're not emphasizing the wrong syllable to make it seem weird. So it's something you kind of just have to learn through practice of of really working with the text itself and just reading it to yourself and figuring out what words, if I was saying this line, how would I say it? What words would I emphasize then, and then try to emphasize the same thing with singing. It can be difficult especially if English wasn't your first language and you don't know how to accent. Like I was trying to mark a Slavonic troparion last night, but it was in Russian script, so there's no accents, right? So then I had to go to the Slavonic and find the accents and then mark them first before I could mark the text to be able to sing. So it can be applied to any language. So it's the same kind of thing. So you just have to be able to read the text and make it understandable. Yeah, the link to the learning the tones, I think, has some information on that, but it really just takes practice and having somebody check it, and comparing it to the other ones. I mean, we use the Rokor Manean too at my church, so it's not the same. And down here in Texas, we have our former bishop who is reposed. He translated everything himself too, so we all use a totally different translation for a lot of things than everybody else. We have our own service book, we have our own Psalter, we have our own Orologian that just the churches in Dallas use, and nobody else. So it's its own little area. So yeah, it's there are so many different Englishes. I don't know if we'll ever get to the point where we can agree on English in this country, but if we did, that would be great. But yeah, so you have to just look at the text and you mark it in a way that makes sense, to the hearer. The whole point. None of the music stuff is as important as the text being understood.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that's the first goal, is to make sure that you want to make sure you're not emphasizing the wrong word or the wrong syllable.
The wrong syllable.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
So that's the goal. Yeah. Who else has questions?
This is
just
just
about 15 more minutes.
This is just more related to choir directing in general, but our church is looking to hire a choir director and actually pay them.
Mm-hmm.
And how many hours per week would you say is would be responsible to put into the services if you're doing, the weekend services and feast services and maybe one weekday service?
So it really depends on. There's so many variables that go into that. Part of it is the size of the choir. How are you doing it? We still do vigil, even as we've gotten bigger, where we actually put everything in the binder every week. So, we take out all the October stuff from the last week and insert every page into the binder, and the Manean stuff too. We have 5 binders for vigil. So that can take a good hour to 2 hours for one person to empty out the binder, put everything in order for the new service, then put it into all the binders. And that's just 2 hours of sitting there with binders, in addition to then doing a 2.5 hour vigil and liturgy and maybe a weekday Vespers too that you have to put in. So there is prep time, but it'll really depend on how it's done. Our cathedral has everything in Dallas put into booklets, so they don't actually insert everything into the binder. They just pass out a booklet for tone 1 and a booklet for the Manean, and they all just kind of go through with those. So it's a little bit less work. It kind of just depends. That's how I do weekday vigils usually, is just put a stapled stack with everything in it, and we just kind of go through that way. But it really depends on the variables. But it can take a good hour or two for one person at least to set up vigils. Then you have choir rehearsals, as somebody just mentioned, depending on how often you're doing those. My choir, we do an hour before vigil pretty much at least 3 weeks a month, if not more. So you've got that on top of it. I have assistant directors though who help me put services together and things like that. So there's a lot that goes into that. But yeah, you would want to include choir rehearsals, setting up books. Typically, you're going to want to require the weekend services, great feasts. You got to make sure you put Holy Week in Pascha in the description. If you want to require them to be there for Christmas or not. And then maybe even weekday services. Like I usually typically do at least one Vespers or Vigil a week too, myself. So those are all the kind of amount of hours, but it could be, anywhere from 5 to 10 hours a week for one person. Yeah. Plus just, and also, planning and rehearsals, all that kind of stuff. So kind of like a teacher, you got to have a planning period thrown in there for how you're going to do things, especially if you switch music a lot. If you are going to be working on that, like we just did new liturgy books. That took a really long time to put all those together. There's quite a bit of work that goes into some things like that. So those are also some of the things you might want to look at. And the experience of the choir director, are you gonna have somebody who has an actual music degree versus somebody who doesn't, and how you're gonna figure that out.
Thank you.
Good questions. Yeah, sure. I'm about to speak to our diocesan clergy on that almost that exact topic in about a week. So for the second time about paying choir directors. So it's good that you're going to try to do it. What other questions? Anybody else have any questions? Yeah. So you've got my email address, or you'll have it at least. Again, it's in the article. If you go to the OC website and click on the article that was for these sessions, you can find my email address in there. If you have more questions, if you are interested in learning more about anything, like I said, I teach this kind of stuff on a regular basis too. So they're very interesting topics, I think. So what? So somebody asked how much we rehearse. Last question. Again, my choir typically does at least 3 hours a month. We typically do Saturdays before Vigil, like today. We'll meet at 4 for we have an Archbishop visit coming up, so we'll be doing some hierarchical stuff this week, and then we also have a concert that we're doing sort of next week too with the Pan-Orthodox choir. So there's lots of rehearsals going on. But yeah, about 3 hours a month at least usually is typical. And to try to learn new things. But this session, again, it was recorded. It will be posted on the OCA's YouTube channel, hopefully within a couple days. So just check there, go to Orthodox Church in America on YouTube. And you can also find last year's sessions that Dr. Morrison did on Lenten services. So if you have questions about that. And then next Sunday the 20th at, I believe, 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central, will be the session on Matins. And again, if you can't make it to that, it will also be recorded and posted on YouTube. And then the following Saturday the 26th, which is right there before Meat Fair, we will again at 1:00 Eastern time have the session on Matins. But again, it will also be recorded too. So if you have further questions, please feel free to email me and I will respond to them. And if not, bring your questions to the Vespers and Matins seminars. And we did decide to not cap them. So feel free to, don't worry about registering. We actually had 155 people register for today, although only about 80 ended up showing up. But we're not capping it at 100. So feel free to register for those. Tell your friends, send out the link, and people can continue registering for those. And I want to thank everybody for being here today. So great. All right. Everybody have a blessed Saturday and a blessed beginning of the Triodian. And don't forget, if you are doing Vigil tonight, that you have to sing Open the Doors of Repentance tonight. So tonight's the first night. So throw it in your books. Don't forget. I've accidentally forgot it before, many years ago. So don't forget to throw it in. And have a blessed weekend. And we'll see you all next week.